Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Scope here on British Muslim TV with me, your host, Waqar Rizvi. Today, we're going to be discussing Tunisia and the constitutional referendum that has occurred there. And just to let you know, we are being, as I say every week, being broadcast live throughout wherever BMTV is broadcast live via satellite, as well as through various BMTV social media channels as well, such as Facebook and others live. Also, you can also see the numbers at the bottom of your screen right now. You can always send in your comments and questions, even throughout the show, in fact. And if any of them are relevant to the show, I may very well bring them up with our esteemed panelists. Now, as I said, Tunisia's constitutional referendum. Tunisia, the country, was once hailed as the only success story, really, of the Arab Spring, where it all began. In fact, back in 2011, I covered that revolution in great detail as a journalist myself as well, sitting in the studio, and the positive vibes there were in the air when Zain al-Abidin Ben Ali left the country. And there was a lot of course, hope for democracy finally being ushered in to parts of the Arab world and North Africa. Now, the country has held, just yesterday, a referendum on a new constitution that may solidify, unfortunately, one-man rule. That is according to many experts. Kais Saied, the man who has ushered in this new era, says he wants to help stabilize the country's dismal economy as well as its institutions, which he says are in disarray, and arguably many Tunisians would agree. He also says that he would possibly need those strongman tactics to be able to do so. Now, opponents of Saied, who pushed for a largely successful boycott, if we're honest, of the referendum, say that this is a dangerous milestone for the country. According to exit polls, and I will be keeping an eye on if official results come out throughout this live show, exit polls say that approximately 92% of voters, who represent only really 27% approximately of the electorate, supported the constitutional changes that Saied has demanded, which give him unprecedented control over government bodies and decision making. What does this mean then? I'm repeating myself, for the democracy then, or the dream of democracy in the Arab world since 2011. Let's discuss those issues and others further with our panelists. We're joined by Dr. Nathan Grubman, who is a lecturer in civic, liberal, and global education at Stanford University. He's also currently working on a book on Tunisia's party system after the revolution. We're also joined by Matt Gordner, who is the co-founder of Tanmiya Consulting. He is currently also a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, and he's working on a dissertation about the revolution in Tunisia. Matt and Nate, thank you both for taking your time out of your busy schedules to join us today. Nate, I'll start off right at the top from you. How did we reach this point, do you think, since 2011? And of course, there's a lot of steps along the way, but just overall, why did governance and that hope for democracy go wrong, essentially, in Tunisia that we are now at this point in 2022?
Thank you, and thank you for having me on this show. Tunisia has experienced significant difficulties related to its economy and also the security situation in the years since the 2011 revolution. Kais Saied has been very successful in channeling some of that frustration against the political elites in the country and the country's democratic institutions. He has made the argument that the balance of powers that was created by the 2014 Constitution is in actuality a system for elites to split spoils among themselves, and also is a way for elites to avoid being held accountable. So he is arguing that that sort of consolidating responsibility in his hands will allow the state to return to its proper function and will address the many social and economic problems that have beset the country since the revolution.
Okay, and just to let you know that we are having some problems with our name bands, but just going to you then, Matt, on that same issue then about where things may have gone wrong. You know, there is an argument to be made, and I had spoken about this offer with both of you, that last year when Kais Saied went after the parliament, initially, in fact, Tunisians supported that. So that's also almost emblematic, is it not, of the point that they had reached in frustration with the ruling class, even since the revolution, that is?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a very withdrawn process of constitution writing followed by successive elections in which there was what we called bargain competition among the major political players and political parties. where they were doing backroom deals and sort of chugging along to maintain their position of power, but weren't really representing any constituents to any degree. The opposition was quite divided along the way. As my colleague Nate has said, there was a security problem where there were some assassinations of left-wing leaders, and that certainly diluted the power from the left. But also there's been a major corporatist arrangement going on, arguably between the major political parties, but also the labor union. And so I think a lot of people are simply fed up. It's not so much that they're apathetic as is they have no other option left but to throw all their marbles into this one man.
Nate, let's go issue by issue if we may then, right? Because one of the big ones is obviously the economy. And all reports say that even going to this referendum, that was one of the biggest issues about why those who did support Said, in fact, support him, because they feel that he will create enough stability within the country and within governance to be able to then fix the economy. Is that true? Do you think Said is the man with the answer for the economy?
It's true that in every public opinion poll that I've seen since 2011, Tunisians have expressed the notion that the economy and perhaps the security situation are the most important problems to be addressed. Kais Saied has suggested that he has communicated that he will be able to crack down on corruption, that he will restore the proper function of the state, that he will be able to address problems of inflation. But to answer your question, no, I don't think that he's capable on his own of addressing Tunisia's many economic problems. First, he has not really proposed any sort of specific platform for addressing them. The one thing that he has proposed going back to 2011 or 2012 has been sort of a reconciliation with corrupt business people in the country in order to fund local development projects. And he did pass a decree to implement this, but it's unclear, to what extent this sort of policy solution will work in addressing Tunisia's problems. More pressing, the country is currently in negotiations with the IMF. The IMF is likely to be looking for some sort of austerity measures, particularly focused on the public sector wage block and on subsidies, on fuel and on basic goods. It's unfortunate that Tunisia is in a position right now of either going along with the status quo or of adopting austerity policies. There's widespread consensus that the state needs to rethink how it's investing its budget in order to create growth, in order to address problems of inequality. Kais Saied has not really created the conditions for that kind of debate to take place today. And he has not put forth a political system for disagreements about those issues to be resolved efficiently in the future.
One point that I want to bring up with you, Matt, is something that Nate just pointed out at the beginning of his answer, and that is about previous officials, right? And those officials who may have even worked with Ben Ali, in fact, when he was in power. And there was a lot of debate even right after the revolution, right, within the first government that came into power about whether or not those who worked with Ben Ali should also still have positions or have some role to play in the country. What are your thoughts on that? Because I would think that a complete clean break is probably not completely practical because they have a lot of influence in the country.
Sure. And in fact, we saw this dynamic play out in a number of ways over the last 10 years. The most immediate after the revolution itself happened in the Kasbah Square, where the major political parties infiltrated a lot of the activist camps in order to then push the country towards a direction that would automatically reignite a party politics system and sort of entrench those powers that be back into the government. And that's indeed what we saw. A lot of the former ministers under Ben Ali came back to power. There was very little in terms of a reshuffle of the political class, and certainly those communities that were most marginalized were not able to have their voices heard. This happened sort of yet again on a very high elite level when the quartet, the national dialogue, when there was a stalled government within Tunisia and the quartet came back in, of course, that was a union between very high-level organizations, the judges' order, the lawyers' order, and of course the employers' union and the UGTT. And yet again, the international community sort of signaled that this was a very positive step towards democracy, but didn't really give any credits to folks on the ground who had really come out onto the streets in order to push for this dialogue to happen. So we do see that in Tunisia there has been a recurrence of these legacies of authoritarianism, but of course they're very hard to break.
Yeah. And so how does one break out of that then, Nate? Is this a question of the fact that these are just growing pains in some ways? Like, I mean, there's always that comparison made, right, with other democracies. And many people would say that's unfair because this revolution just happened in 2011. So it's still fairly new in that sense.
I agree that we should adopt long-term perspectives, but this passage of this constitution, what's happened over the past year is a major setback to the Tunisian state and certainly to its democracy. I don't think that there are too many examples of other countries who have had this sort of authoritarian breakdown in a new or democratic breakdown in a newly democratic country and have quickly recovered their democracy. I think that this will take some time to settle.
And Matt, what are your thoughts about how long? I mean, obviously no one knows a crystal ball scenario how long this would take, but do you think that this is just growing pains, or do you agree with Nate that this is a very serious step back in this process?
Yeah, like Nate, I would caution against sort of predicting. Political science is classically terrible at this kind of thing. But we can say that with the military and security services behind him, it'll be very difficult to dislodge the sort of power that he's consolidated around himself. What I could see happening is that, given the fact that, as Nate has indicated, there is no real economic plan, and all indications.
Matt, I'm going to have to cut you off. I do apologize. We're just about to go into a very quick break. Viewers, do stay tuned with us. We're just going to be back with Matt Gordner and Nathan Grubman. After this break, we're going to continue discussing the constitutional referendum in Tunisia. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're back here in the scope with me, Waqar Rizvi, and continue to discuss Tunisia's constitutional referendum with Matt Gordner and Nate Grubman. Matt, because I cut you off right before we were going to break, I'm going to put this question to you first. And, there's a lot of talk, obviously, about the fact that this referendum in and of itself was obviously not free and fair. A lot of observers, international observers, in fact, some of them refused to come in, according to reports. And then there's a lot of questions about the constitutionality, in fact, of this referendum and the way Said pushed it forward. But even keeping all of that in mind, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but the fact that Tunisians have not created a lot more chaos on the streets, does that almost show that they are, I don't know if the word is desensitized to this process?
This is a difficult question to answer, especially given that there isn't a Tunisian activist on the panel to sort of speak for the grassroots. But what I can say, having done extensive research with activists and in the development space myself, is that civil society organizations are few and far between that are effective in Tunisia. There are a handful that serve as watchdogs over the country. And those that do the kind of good governance and human rights work that sort of stick their lions on the neck are understandably concerned that if they come out into the limelight, they're going to be chopped. And there's, like I said, a history of authoritarianism in a very, very authoritarian state under Ben Ali, and folks have extensive memories in that regard. There's also a real reticence on the part of a new generation of activists to come out and to put their names on their campaigns. So we see a lot more anonymous forms of leadership. And that's not to say that there isn't protest going on in the country and that there isn't planning going on in the country, but rather a lot of people are playing the wait-and-see game for very existential reasons.
And certainly, obviously, the name Rashid Ghannouchi comes up, as the Ennahda head who's been treated pretty badly, I mean, of recent especially. But Nate, I wonder, and there's a reason I brought up that point with Matt, and there's a lot of talk about the fact that because the opposition is so disunited, that for that reason, that actually hurts their stance against Said and their argument against Said, because they haven't been able to unite behind one message. I mean, is that a fair criticism of the opposition in this case?
Yes, I think it's a fair criticism. To be fair to actors who are opposing Qais Said, a lot of them are being threatened with various legal measures that have made it difficult to operate. They're operating in an environment in which, as you mentioned, the playing field is hardly even. But divisions in the opposition have made it difficult for the opposition to present a clear alternative. It has not been clear, the opposition has not made it clear what would happen if this referendum were to be defeated, what would happen if Qais Said were to be removed somehow. Qais Said and his supporters try to portray the choice as this constitution, the July 25th path. We're going back to the kind of unpopular political system that preceded it. It's important for the opposition to be able to communicate some sort of third alternative that is more broadly appealing. And to this point, they haven't been successful in doing so.
Matt, if we may, I wanted to look at the more regional implications of this, because, you know, as I said right at the top of our discussion in the intro, that there was a lot of hope, especially after what happened in Tunisia with the Arab Spring and Ben Ali's ouster, and the fact that it was seen as the first success story of the Arab Spring. Are we going in some ways the way of Egypt, in the sense that we're arguably, even Egypt had a lot of external influences from a lot of those sheikhdoms, and especially the Persian Gulf region, the Saudis, et cetera, you know, essentially pushing Sisi into power in some ways, or at least, you know, legitimizing his power. Do you think we are going that way in some ways in Tunisia?
I mean, certainly in the lead up and during the coup, Qais Said made visits to heads of state. For example, he made a visit to Egypt, and many suspect that perhaps there was an exchange there. I think what's more important to concentrate on here is the ways in which the political subjectivities of the Arab Revolution and the Arab Spring in general across the region had changed people's minds about even the possibility of attaining democracy and human rights. I wouldn't be so negative as to say this is the end of the Arab Spring or the end of an experiment. That would be putting a timeline on something that is likely to have a generational process. But certainly this is not boding well for Democrats in the region, let alone in Tunisia.
On that point then of democracy in the region, specifically in Tunisia, and then of course regional implications, Nate, you know, right at the beginning of the Arab Spring, there was also another argument made, and quite an offensive one, if I may say, but I'm just going to bring it up here for the sake of argument, that the fact that many people said the Arab world is simply not prepared for democracy and what democracy brings. They don't have those quote unquote ideals within themselves because they haven't really had that sort of rule and governance. What do you make of that all these years later now? I mean, I don't want to say it's being proven correct, but I mean, in some ways, some of them probably feel like maybe they've been vindicated.
Yeah, so I wrote in a recent piece that despite these expectations that there's something peculiar about Islam or Arab culture that's going to make democratization difficult, the reasons that have felled Tunisia's democracy are very cosmopolitan. The rise of authoritarian populism is a global phenomenon. Frustration with the economic production under this new political system is common in new democracies. So it is true that the uprisings that took place in 2010 and 2011 did not bear long-lasting democratic systems, but in my reading, that is not due to some sort of peculiar characteristic of the cultures in these places. And I also want to echo Matt's point that although this is a tremendous setback, There are some fruits of the past 10 years that I think are really important to preserve in terms of some of the civil society organizations that have been created, in terms of some of the investigative journalism that that has happened over the past 10 years, in terms of cultural flourishing, films that have been produced, this kind of thing. So I think it's very important that those who are concerned with democracy in Tunisia continue to push for these spaces to be preserved during this very difficult time.
On that point, then, Matt, it may be argued that, and Saeed has said that once, the results come out and they're confirmed, that one of his first steps will be to discuss and to bring forward an election law, right, of some sort, or an election decree, I believe he may have called it, if I'm not mistaken. But nevertheless, I mean, do you think that even he realizes, as both of you have pointed out, that things have changed in the country? Then it's not just going to be a simple ride for him where he just gets to essentially rule as one man, that he needs to at least put up the facade of some sort of democracy, and that in and of itself is important progress?
Yeah, if I can answer that. I think that there have been tremendous gains within civil society since 2010, 2011. Very, very prosperous, impressive gains, and networks built among activists, NGOs, and social movements. And that's going to be difficult to just do away with. There's a lot of funding from the international community that's going into Tunisia. Offices have moved from Egypt and Libya to base themselves out of Tunis. It will be very difficult for Saeed to make a strong case, even if he's going to use conspiratorial thinking about Western influence, in order to have a mass exodus of civil society the way that happened in Egypt, without calling attention to the authoritarian nature of the state. So obviously we have yet to see, but it would draw a lot of attention on Qais Said if indeed he reformed a civil society law that revamped the system entirely.
Let's do a full circle back, if we may, Nate, and go back to the results as we know them just from the exit polls, right? And just about turnout. Turnout is really low. I mean, around 27%, right? According to the estimates, 27.5%, according to most is what I've seen. That hurts his legitimacy in this regard, right? I mean, I'm sure that's at the back of his mind. How is he going to continue to sell this then?
So Qais Said and mainly his supporters were trying to set very low expectations going in. They argued that this referendum is being held in, at a very hot time. Well, there's COVID-19 spreading, that it's at the end of a holiday weekend. So I think, that 27% actually exceeded the expectations of some. But as you point out, it is still a very low number relative to other constitutional referenda in the world. I've been unable to find any other constitutional referendum that has a turnout so low. And I imagine that, yes, it is a sign of limited enthusiasm for his political project. He is a political leader that does not have a traditional organization behind him. And so that ability to project popularity is very important to Qais Said. He will declare this a victory. He will point to conspiracies that were aiming to make the referendum fail. But this is a sign of some of the limits to his popularity, and that is important.
In some ways, and this is dangerous, is it not, Nate? Because I would think that this means that he can probably be a lot more heavy-handed to ensure he gets his way. I mean, obviously he realizes that he's not popular right now, but then, that can go very bad, right, for Tunisians?
Yeah, so that's a major question, whether the passage of this constitution, which at least on paper does give him it formalizes the powers that he's given himself over the last year, whether that will presage a real crackdown. As I mentioned earlier, there have been a number of members of the former parliaments, former presidential candidates, the head of the Anti-Corruption Commission, the former head of the Election Commission. All of them have been called to appear in various court cases. It's unclear to what extent Qais Said has managed to to gain control of the judiciary. And I think that that is a major question going forward. This constitution gives him formal powers to exert more control over the judiciary, but in the past, the judiciary has had kind of strong corporate united power. And so I'm curious to see how they will stand up to him in the future.
All right, I think we're going to have to leave it there at that. But of course, we appreciate both Matt Gordner and Nate Grubman. We're going to leave it there that we discussed, of course, the Tunisia constitutional referendum with both of our esteemed panelists. We will, of course, keep a very close eye on the results as they come out, but we're not expecting any different results than what the exit polls have said. And we're going to keep a close eye, of course, on what this means for North Africa and the Middle East region as well. Thank you very much for watching this episode of The Scope here on British Muslim TV with me, Waqar Rizvi.